Hi, I'm Graham Blackburn, and this is Traditional Woodworking by Hand. And in our continuing series on the fewest number of tools that you actually need, this episode 4 is all about essential holding devices. So, we've talked about measuring devices, we've talked about saws, and we've talked about planes. And now in episode 3, we're going to talk about what I consider to be the third great rule of woodworking, which is that unless you're a freehand carver, there's almost nothing that you can do without years of practice accurately and safely freehand. There is a jig for almost everything. But to get started, we're just going to talk about two jigs today, two essential jigs. If you're more interested, you can look at one of the many books that I've written, and this will give you an idea of how many jigs there actually are. This is a whole book contained lots and lots of illustrations for almost any operation that you want to do. There's some kind of jig. But the two that we're going to talk about today really are essential and will enable you to do a whole lot. So what are they? Well, the first jig is known as a bench hook. And this actually has two advantages. The first advantage is that it also addresses the second great rule of woodworking, which is that you should always try and keep the workpiece very secure. A bench hook is just any piece of scrap wood with a hook at one end and a hook on the other side at the other end. And you can see that if I hold that, this is the workpiece, relatively small piece, but it's perfectly secure. So it helps hold the workpiece secure. Now, what else does it do? Well, it's primarily, not totally, but primarily used for sawing. If I need to saw the end of this piece of wood, we've talked about how to mark it and how to hold the saw and everything. And with a lot of practice, you probably could get pretty good at sawing a perfectly square, perfectly vertical line. But with the bench hook, like this, you can do it almost without looking. So what is the bench hook? Well, it's any piece of scrap wood, and I make them all the time, with a hook at one end and a hook at the other end. And if I very carefully make a curve in the hook, and then I use the same saw that I used to make the curve, and I want to saw the end of this piece of wood, I can just work like this without even looking. And I'm guaranteed to get a perfectly square, perfectly true cut. Now you can see that there are several curves in here. That illustrates the fact that not only can I use different saws, here's a much bigger saw, and this saw was used to make this curve. So if I had a longer piece of wood or a heavier piece of wood, I'd use this saw in this curve. When I'm cutting really big pieces, it can also help to keep yourself another piece of wood that's the same thickness as this, so that you can support both ends. Right? Now this piece of wood can't fall down. So that's an extra little trick that you should bear in mind. But let's get back to the curves. How do we do this and what's important? Well, the first thing is that it really helps to have a piece of wood that has a straight side, because in addition to sawing, we can also use it as a guide, I'll show you in a little while, for planing. Now, the thing to remember, most importantly, about making a bench hook is that you might think the easiest thing to do was to get a piece of scrap wood, clamp a hook on the end, and then just drill holes through it and screw into it. But I can guarantee that if you use screws, like I did on this bench hook here, sooner or later, when you're making specific curves, you're going to end up sawing through the screws. So it's much better to do what we did with this bench hook and simply use dowels. It doesn't matter if I saw through the dowels. So that's an important thing to do. Now, I like to try and keep this straight, and I like to try and keep the hook perfectly square to the end. You can check that with your square. You can see that the hook is square to the side of the bench hook. This allows me to put the workpiece on like this, and I can saw straight ahead using the same saw, as I said before, that I used to make the kerf. A couple of other things. When I make these kerfs, I pay a lot of attention, a lot of care to make them perfectly square and perfectly vertical. But that's not all that they can do. Not only can I use different size kerfs made with different saws for different size pieces of wood, but I can change the angle. If you look here, you can see that I've made a mitre. So if I needed to saw a mitre, I can put the saw in there, and now, bingo, once again, without even looking, I'm guaranteed to make a perfect mitre. All of these that you see here are square across the top, and they're perfectly vertical going down. But it doesn't have to be that way. They can be any angle you like, and they can be at any vertical angle you like, even to the point, or something that we'll show you in future episodes, that you can, without having to measure or be really careful, you can make end-to-end dovetails. You can cut this kerf here so that it's at the angle, and you can cut it at a slope, and then you can put this, clamp it over here like this, and you'll be able to saw one of these. So this really is a very versatile way of making sure that what you're sawing is at the right angle and the right slope. Just remember, try not to use screws but use dowels, and try to keep the ends square. Now, I mentioned that you can use it for sawing. There is one other use that I sometimes make. I frequently get to join long boards together if I'm making tabletops or countertops or things like that. And one way of joining long boards together, assuming that you've got the edges perfectly straight and square, is with dowels. So if I want to make a lot of dowels all the same size, I might make a shooting board that's missing the end here, that is the length of the dowel that I want to make. Imagine that this were a dowel. I could put this on here like this, and without even looking, I can saw as many dowels as I want, all to the same length. That's like another really neat thing to do. I should point out, of course, that in conjunction with the fact that the hook gives you the opportunity to secure the work, if you've really got a big piece of wood that you're trying to saw, you should also make sure that you can use the holdfast like this. Now the piece of wood is perfectly secure. So it does two things. It keeps the workpiece secure, and it allows you to saw at any angle and at any slope. So I absolutely think that whatever jig that you might develop, you definitely need a bench hook or two or three. They don't last for very long. You can see this one here is almost sawn all the way through. That's because when you saw, you typically saw at a bit of an angle, and sooner or later that all wears out. But they're not hard to make, and they guarantee that you'll end up making a perfect saw cut. The second jig that I consider essential is not for sawing, but for planing. Now, this is called a shooting board, and there you can even buy these new, which I think is a bit weird. If you're going to make furniture and you can't make your own shooting board, you're not going to have much luck with the furniture. But let's look at what this is. All it is two pieces of wood. The bottom piece down here, and on top of it is the top piece, or the table. This is the base, this is the table, and there's a stop at the end here. Now, something that I find really useful is that if on the underside of the bottom I attach a couple of cleats like this that are the same distance apart as the width of my bench, that makes this really nice and secure to hold on the bench. And if I put it here, then it's good. And if it's close to the hold fast, I can even hold the work down. The stop here is, in this case, it's fixed, but you might want to perhaps attach this with a screw so that you can change it. And that's because the commonest mistake that people make when they use a shooting board is to think that the plane that you're using on the shooting board runs against the edge of the table, the edge of the table at the top here. But that's not true. You plane just as if you were planing in the vise, and you would be planing to a line. Say we had a pencil line down here, and you would put the board on the shooting board, and maybe if it's a really long piece, you might want to absolutely secure it. And now you can plane, and what this is doing is giving you a perfectly straight and perfectly square edge. Why? Well, as we've mentioned before, you cannot plane anything flatter than the flatness of the sole of your plane. In addition, if you're going to use a shooting board, you have to make sure that the side of the plane that rests on the board is perfectly perpendicular to the sole. That's very, very important. In the old days, we used to use a block plane. This is actually a 19th century block plane, not like the modern ones that we have now, but it's relatively low angle, it's a single blade, the bevel is up, and it's just a block of wood. This was the plane that was used to plane on a shooting board. But you can use any plane you like, providing that the sole is perfectly flat, and that's one reason why I like wooden planes, because it's easier to make sure that the sole is flat simply by planing it with another plane. You can use a Stanley type plane, and since the craft revolution of the 70s, when finally after almost 100 years, tool manufacturers started to make really good quality hand tools again, some companies like Lee Nielsen, for example, actually reinvented block planes, and this is a plane designed specifically for using with a shooting board, which is why it has a handle up here, so you can plane like this. And since this is flat and this is square and this is on the table and I'm planing to the line that I can see here, I'm guaranteed to make a perfectly straight square cut. But you don't have to have $1,000 shooting board plane. You can just have a regular $5 wooden plane and it'll do the same thing. I want to show you a couple of other things. This is good if you're making straight cuts, but I mentioned that the stop is sometimes movable. That's because not always is the end of the wood square. It may be kind of bent, maybe like this, right? And now I need a stop. So if I can turn that around, then I've got a more secure place to rest the board here. I can also do a couple of other things. I don't always need to be planing the edge of a piece of wood. Sometimes I may need to be planing a mitre. So here's another thing that happens. This piece of wood here can fit into the holes here like this, and then I can support the workpiece against this, and now you can see that whatever plane I happen to be using, I can plane at the exact right angle. One other thing that this shooting board can do is to allow you to plane things that are not necessarily at 90 degrees. If your plane, as I mentioned before, has a flat bottom and a perfectly perpendicular side, you're kind of locked in to a 90-degree angle. But with a pair of wedges, I made a couple of wedges here for some job I had a while ago. These are 7 degrees. If I put the wedges on the shooting board like this, now I can put the workpiece on the wedges and you'll see that it's tilted at 7 degrees. Once again, without even looking, I can now plane, and bingo, I'm going to get a perfect 7-degree angle. All of this is to point out that if you use the right jig, you can be guaranteed accuracy. I should mention one other thing for people who like to collect tools, that when Stanley came along and started to duplicate all the traditional wooden tools with metal tools, they also made a shooting board. They called it a shoot board, spelled C-H-U-T-E. I don't really know why. And they provided it with its own plane, and it had its own levers and cams and all kinds of things. If you're interested in one of those, by all means go to eBay or some specialty antique woodworking supply company, and you can probably find one for about $1,000. But doesn't it make a little more sense to make one out of 2 pieces of scrap wood? So there we have it. Bench hooks for sawing, shooting boards for planing, straight edges, angled edges, cambered edges, whatever. If you remember that it's very unusual to do anything in woodworking by hand, freehand, you're going to have to have been practicing for a long time to do it accurately. So if you want to go to my website, you can find the books that I mentioned. You can also find information on how to sign up for lessons. And I hope to see you next time when we do part 4 of the least number of tools that you need. And this is going to be odds and sods. Don't forget to subscribe. Hit the subscribe button. Thank you very much. We've got so many subscribers now, it's hard for me to answer all the queries. But if you've got a question or you've got a nice comment, people like to see it, by all means feel free to write in and say something. Thanks for watching. Good woodworking.